authoritative. All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started this morning and get our lesson going this morning. By way of introduction, I'm Seth Conder. I'm here because of my great-grandparents, the Huffstedlers and the Condors, my grandparents, the Condors and the Hogues, and my parents, Dale and Dorinda Conder. So I'm a lifelong Church of Christer. I was baptized right here when I was 14 years old, and I'm trying to continue that tradition forward with my family and my three little minions. So I do that because it helps me or lets you guys know who I am, but it also is going to relate to what we're going to talk about today. So if you wouldn't mind, if your Bible is handy, go ahead and turn it open to the book of Job. So we're going to do, I'm going to be teaching this week and next week, so we're going to do the world's quickest study of Job. And to be honest, when I was looking around what I wanted to speak about this week and next, my personal Bible reading lately has been, for some reason, focused in the Old Testament. Actually, the two books mainly I've been reading is Job and Isaiah, and so I picked Job because it's actually the shorter of the two books to maybe talk about. I guess there's some things topically we could talk about, but I think when I get out a little more context here of what or why this got stirred up in my brain, it'll make a little sense. So I'm going to introduce what I'm going to be talking about today, and then we'll actually read quite a bit today. And my plan is to actually have maybe some discussion either with those around you or internally. But as a teacher, a PE teacher, you might just think I'm throwing balls at kids and yelling and screaming at them. But as a teacher, the way I try to get my students to learn is to ask questions or to ask them questions and to spark curiosity. And so this morning, I'm not promising really to teach you anything. I'm really just promising to ask you questions that maybe get you to think more about your relationship with God, the character of God, and how that kind of all fits in here with the book of Job. So in that light, I'm going to start with a couple questions here before we read, and then we'll get going. So the book of Job, if we're not aware, if we haven't read this, is essentially it's all about the wager. We have God versus Satan, and essentially there's a proposition between God and Satan. Hey, is Job going to remain faithful if you let me torture him a little bit? And so it stirs up a lot of questions, at least the questions that come up in my head when I read Job is life meant to be fair? Are physical challenges a test from God? Does tragedy mean I have angered God? Does God even care about his creation? And the biggest one is, why is God silent? Because until we get to next week when we kind of give God's response in Job, God essentially lets the devil have his way with Job and then just says nothing. And I think for a lot of us, we can identify with that because we've had personal things, whether they're physical, a loved one passing away, where we've felt that silence of God and we've wondered what that means. And I think it's a question that stirs in all of us. And personally, not to create pity or empathy or sympathy for me, but a lot of this got stirred up in me when I was 25. My mom died. From diagnosis to death, it was 6 months. She had brain cancer and gone. So the book of Job, to me, helps me relate to that idea of why is God silent? Or did I anger him? Or did I do something? I know, and that's kind of my thought process, at least sort of kind of a little bit of the background that gets my brain thinking about what's going on here in Job. So before I talk any longer, let's let the Bible speak. So I'm going to read quite a bit here. I'm going to read the full first chapter of Job so we understand or get a sense of what's going on here between God and Satan in relation to Job. In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys. He had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among the people of the East. His sons used to take turns holding feasts in their homes. They would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would sin and have them purified. Early in the morning he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular custom. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's none on earth like him. He's blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You bless the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your hands, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabeans attacked and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I'm the only one who escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." At this Job got up and tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell to the ground in worship. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Pretty powerful ending to that chapter there. So before we get to the second chapter, because there's kind of a second series of trials that God puts Job through, I want to talk about kind of the way my brain looks at the book of Job. And it's really about, maybe it's a disservice here, but we're going to skip over talking about Satan. And we're going to really focus on the relationship between God and Job, because all of us hopefully have a personal relationship with God. And hopefully we can kind of try to relate it in that context of knowing or seeing maybe what God has planned for us in our relationship with him. So when I think of who God is, we think of God as love. God is good. He's the creator, sustainer, provider, guide, shepherd. We could go on, and we could all go around and come up with different names or titles for God. But then we think of who we are, who is man. And I wanted to read from Genesis, actually, as well here to support this thought, to kind of see who we were intended to be, as the created. So I'm going to read real quickly here, actually from Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 27 through 31. Just a quick little blurb here. "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground.' Then God said, 'I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit and seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food.' And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day." So when I look at who's God's character and then who we are, and trying to put this into the context of the book of Job, we were created to maintain and manage God's creation. I think, as an aside here, I think as Christians we've kind of given away that space to other groups to say, hey, we need to take care of the planet. But I think actually as Christians, that's an area where maybe we could do a little more. But if we look at it, we were given purpose. And as we read further on in Genesis, there's a job that's given to man, and in its most basic sense, it's work. It's purpose. We are all supposed to work It looks very different, but if you look at the original intent, it was literally, hey, everyone was going to be taking care of the earth, farming, however you want to look at that. But the big thing here is we are also made in his image, as it says in verse 27. So we have God's character, we have us as the creation. So how do we interlink those two and look at that relationship in the context of Job? Because what we see here in Job, chapter 1, that doesn't look like a loving God, or maybe even a good God per se. So how do we square this knot here? And the questions that come to my brain is this idea of, the first question I would pose is, was Job doing what God wanted him to do? Right? He was. He was very fruitful. He was multiplying. I was going to start doing the math on his flocks and everything, but Job would probably be a multimillionaire in today's terms. And imagine all of that just being sucked away, right? So he was doing things, and it pretty much says everything he did was pleasing to God. I think, God even says that himself. But this is the question that, at least I think, the book of Job begs to be asked. If God is good, he gave us a purpose, and Job was doing that purpose, then why did Job have to suffer? Or why, as his creation today, why do we still suffer? Why do we have physical afflictions, death, destruction, all these things that we as Christians often look to and say, can God really be present if this is happening? And I don't have any magic answer here. But I think as we read more in Job, and especially next week when we talk really more about God's character, I think we'll see more maybe the answer to this question. So before I go any further, let's read chapter 2 of Job. On another day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present themselves before him. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." "Skin for skin," Satan replied. "A man will give all he has for his own life, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores in the soles of his feet to the top, from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. So I don't know if any of us can, directly identify with Job in terms of, being afflicted with boils from God or having our whole livelihood and family killed. But I think that all of us have a personal connection to Job, or a way that we've been maybe felt God has been unfair to us. Or does he even care about us? Is he punishing us, or is he testing us? And I think my first kind of glance here is that not everything that happens in our lives is a test from God. Just because I trip on the curb walking into church doesn't mean I did something wrong, or my mother dying doesn't mean that I had a gross sin against God. But the idea here that, at least this introduction to Job before we kind of get into this next section, is this idea that we know who God is, his character, we know what we were created for as people. Then why is there this interface where these kind of things have to happen in our lives? Why can't just everything be hunky-dory? And I know the easy answer is, hey, Adam sinned, and we have Jesus, and I get that. And I'm not trying to reduce that down or say that hasn't happened, but I think it's still a question that we still ask ourselves. Even though we know Jesus died, we're forgiven, and we have all those assurances, I think this question doesn't just magically disappear in our brains. And so before we move on any further, instead of me continuing to talk, I'd love for you guys to interject and give me any of your thoughts, ideas. If you think I'm totally off base here, I'd love that. I'd like to be told I'm wrong, or it's good to hear that I'm wrong. So Allison, fire away.
I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. At this point, had Satan not been completely kicked out? Because, I mean, he was coming with the angels. And at some point, God said, now, go, you're gone. So at this point, was he still, obviously, was still grouped in with the angels?
Yeah, so if you look at Job, if like you read how it was written, it's
What was your question?
she was essentially asking when in, I guess to put it
At
simply,
what point,
when in time did this happen? Is that what you're
yeah,
asking?
I mean, obviously, Satan was still with the angels, so at what point did he get kicked out? Completely.
Satan was cast down before all this happened.
Yeah, well, I mean, so you know, a lot of this is written more as like an allegory. So the idea is that this is, I mean, it's using how'd you say it? It's using this narrative to describe God's character, because we don't really know who the author is. It's not it's not what you call it. It's not any of the patriarchs. It's kind of it's an unknown, so we don't really know that per se when in time this was happening. Any other thoughts, Brian?
We tend to think about how God is doing this to Job, but God is not the one doing this to Job. It's Satan doing this to Job.
Yeah.
And what God has done before this and again after this is create that hedge that was talked about in chapter 1.
Yeah.
And it's actually reassuring to think that God has placed a hedge around me to keep all the bad things from happening that Satan would like to do.
Yeah.
So God is actually protecting us when we don't even see it. He has that hedge around us.
Yeah, and just because, to your point, just because something bad happens, I think because we serve God, we think that obviously there's a message trying to be communicated. And the point I really haven't fully brought out yet is also this idea of one of the questions I posed in the beginning of like, why is God always silent? Because in Job, we get the answer at the end. We get God speaks, and that's what we'll kind of talk to next week when God speaks. But yeah, it seems to me that that silence from God in a lot of ways is very challenging, even though we know He's protecting us. And bad things can happen, but yeah, we have the assurance still there. Any other thoughts, Jen?
I believe that we go through those hard times, because that's when we grow. I mean, when your mom dies, for example, that was, that's crushing, that's hard, but it also builds you up so that you can help others in their time when something like that happens to them. So I believe we go through those hard times so we can become stronger people. God knows where we need to grow. He's walking with us.
Well, yeah, to kind of bring it back to that personal story. I mean, one of the challenges for me personally is in that event that pushed my siblings away from God. Essentially, this question that I'm posing today, the answer to them to this question is God is dead if this happens, which is kind of it's really kind of silly to think that like, oh, I'm the first person to ever have my mother die before she saw my kids, right? That's naive in my part to really look at it from that hardship angle of saying like, well, especially here in America, the context we live in, life's pretty good. My mom dying, that's whatever. I'm not worrying about food for tomorrow. I'm not worrying about other insecurities, war, famine. But I do agree with your point that hardship is one of the, what's that saying? Pain is the best teacher. So, any other thoughts before we move on, Vic?
Yeah. As Jimmy was indicated, God's creation and so forth happened way before Job was written.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And Job apparently had a relationship with God because he was sacrificing to him and he was taking care of everything. One of the reasons God put him in charge of everything as he does with us, we can appreciate God's creation. So we can see the nature of God
No, that's actually a perfect kind of bridge here, Vic, because yeah, as you move into Job, at least the meat of it, and that's what I want to do next here, and kind of do this in a little bit of a different way. We really see that these conversations between Job and his three buddies, Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz, which are just they're really great guys. They pretty much just are accosting Job and saying, "Hey, you've sinned, you've done wrong. God's angry at you, obviously." But to the point brought up earlier, that's kind of hard to square away because Job had been made really successful beforehand. So was that God's doing then, and then now He's punishing him? So what's the real story here? But I think you hit the nail on the head there, Vic, in terms of this story is really about when we do go through these things, how does our relationship with God persist through our faithfulness, and what is the motivations of our faith in God? Do we truly desire a relationship that's not contractual, that's about love and concern for one another, or is it literally like, hey, God, what have you done for me? And more kind of like look at it in that context. So, any other thoughts, or before I move on here? Oh, Vic.
I always think of Hebrews chapter 12, obviously, but later on.
Oh yeah,
It
faith.
talks about all the different things that happen to us, the negative things. And God, a lot of times, is disciplining us, trying to teach us. And if we hang in there, it always comes out in the end, which we will see in this story likewise.
Well, and if you look at all to bring that back in, when you look at all of the patriarchs of the Old Testament, they all went through trials. Like that was pretty much like square one of where you had to start. If you wanted to be in God's lineage, you were going to go through a trial or tribulation. That was just going to be part of it. And it was think about the sacrificing of Isaac. That's no small thing. So anyways, to move on here, I want to do something a little different with this next part, and I think we're on track here time-wise. I want to give us roughly about 10 minutes here. So the challenge with Job is I'm going to try to do this in 2 weeks, but obviously we're not going to read all 42 chapters. So two things here. Number one, I would like to encourage you from now until next week maybe to read kind of from chapter 1 to 28 in its entirety if you have some time in your daily reading. But what I would like to do here specific to now is to either with your loved ones, your neighbor, someone around you, or even personally if you would like to open up, and from chapter 3 to 27, there's a series of speeches that Job essentially speaks. Then one of his great buddies, Zophar, Bildad, or Eliphaz, replies. And it kind of goes on and on. Actually, if you really think about like contextually, this would be very wearing if you're Job. You're like, oh my gosh, this guy's going to talk again. But anyways, the point being is I'd like you to maybe pick one of those, and I'll just describe them numerically. So we got 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 is one, 16, 17, 18, 19 and 20, 21 and 22, 3, 4, and 5, and 26 and 27. I know that's a lot of numbers, I'm pretty much saying all of them. But I'd like to encourage you in the next 10 minutes, I'll maybe walk around and talk with you guys about it as we do this, but pick one of those dialogues. I really like 19 and 20 and 21 and 22, and just kind of look at it and see kind of what you see, and then maybe we can draw some things out, and then we'll kind of finish with some final thoughts. So let's go ahead and try that out now. So let's pick your poison. I'll give us a couple more minutes here. Alrighty, I hope I've given you enough time here. Probably haven't. I don't know. Like I said, one of my goals this week is to actually, I don't know. It's how my brain works, and I'm sorry if I'm imposing my will on you, but um, you know, the idea, at least for me personally, when I learn, is looking at something but then going back to it again. And so that's what I'd like to encourage this next week is maybe, hey, not probably. I don't know. I'm assuming most of you guys have read the Book of Job. Hopefully, maybe. But if not, I don't know. It's not probably your go-to scripture for comfort, like the Psalms or Romans or other places where we normally look in scripture. But I don't know. Not that I'm trying to be a Debbie Downer this morning, but I just think this is an interesting question. I just wanted to bring it forward to you guys and get your thoughts. So as you read those kind of discourses between Job and his three pals, was there anything that really stood out to you, or maybe a specific verse or section that you guys like to share before we move on? Vic.
Well, in general, they were wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's the easy sum, and I think I don't know how long of a linear time this discourse was taking time. How long it was. If it was this is a day, was this a week? Was this like every Friday they're meeting up for coffee and they're going to berate him again? It's kind of hard to tell here, but yeah, I think the point being is that they were trying to look for the flaws in Job and saying, obviously you've done something wrong to anger God. But Job was actually if you really look at it, Job was really the optimist in this story. And his buddies were the pessimists, saying, obviously you're just a terrible dude. Whereas Job's trying to see at least it seems like Job's trying to see the good in it, or trying to see what God had envisioned for him. Although there are, times where Job, obviously doesn't, maybe, how would you say that? He's still questioning God, although he still believes and is faithful to him, which I think all of us do, and I think we should do. So if there's no other comments, I'd like to just finish today's lesson with chapter 28, if you'd like to turn there. And the book of Job, it's kind of interesting. This chapter 28, it kind of just is abruptly kind of in the middle here. And it's not Job speaking, it's not any of his buddies. It's actually the author of the book speaking here in chapter 28. And it's almost like I look at it as like a halftime, and he's trying to, almost like, because Job and his buddies can't answer the question they're trying to discuss, it seems like the author needs to, just kind of put his own 2 cents in there in the middle before the discourses go again. So I'm just going to read. As you can tell, I'm relying a lot on the actual reading because I think that's healthy for us. My brain doesn't work well when we just look at 1 or 2 verses. I need to look at a density. So I'm going to read chapter 28 in its entirety here, and I don't know, I'm just going to, when I'm done reading chapter 28, and if you have any parting thoughts, that's fine, but I'm going to kind of just leave it there, because to me, the way chapter 28 kind of brings closure to this idea, at least kind of at this point of Job, of Job has suffered because God has let Satan destroy his life, essentially. There's been questioning of what's going on, but Job still remains faithful. But we're starting to see this turn here in chapter 28, where it's really pivoting to who God is and what he's about and what his plan is for us, and really how it's really hard as humans to even comprehend the depth of who God is or what he's capable of. And I think that's the challenge here in Job, is that sometimes we relate it too much to us as the human, but we also need to look at the Creator and say, oh, what has he done, right? Because I think his pedigree is a little higher than ours. So I'm going to read chapter 28. There's a mine for silver and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth, and copper is smelted from ore. Man puts an end to the darkness. He searches the farthest recesses for ore in the blackest places. Far from where people dwell, he cuts a shaft in places forgotten by the foot of man. Far from men he dangles and sways. The earth from which food comes is transformed below as by fire. Sapphires come from its rocks, and its dust contains nuggets of gold. No bird of prey knows that hidden path. No falcon's eye has seen it. Proud beasts do not set foot on it, and no lion prowls there. Man's hand assaults the flinty rock and lays bare the roots of the mountains. He tunnels through the rock. His eyes see all his treasures. He searches the sources of the rivers and brings hidden things to light. But where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? Man does not comprehend its worth. It cannot be found in the land of the living. The deep says, "It is not me." The sea says, "It is not with me." It cannot be bought with the finest gold, nor can its price be weighed in silver. It cannot be bought with the gold of Ophir, with precious onyx or sapphires. Neither gold nor crystals can compare with it, nor can it be had for jewels of gold. Coral and jasper are worthy of mention. The price of wisdom is beyond rubies. The topaz of Cush cannot compare with it. It cannot be bought with pure gold. Where then does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? Is it hidden from the eyes of every living thing, concealed even from the birds of the air? Destruction and death say, only a rumor of it has reached our ears. God understands the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells. For he views the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he established the force of the wind and measured out the waters, when he made a decree for the rain and a path for the thunderstorm, when he looked at wisdom and appraised it, he confirmed it and tested it. And he said to man, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. I don't know. The first thing I wrote down after I read this chapter in my notes, I just said, wow. Because, the first part of this verse is kind of confusing because it's talking about mining, but it's talking about how we as men can understand the physical properties of the earth, but kind of those mental properties of wisdom, we really struggle to comprehend, or why things could happen, or why, specifically to Job, why this could happen to him. And so I just want to reread that verse 27 and 28, and then I'll shut my mouth and be done. It says, then he looked at wisdom and appraised it. He confirmed it and tested it. And he said to man, the fear of the Lord is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. So we'll just leave it there for today, and we'll pick up. Next week, we're going to mainly focus on kind of the tail end of the book where God actually speaks. Because God, ironically only gets about 5 chapters in this book of 42, but it's the most profound. So we'll kind of be focusing on God's response to Job and his buddies, and he kind of rebukes, to Vic's point, he kind of rebukes Job's friends, but we'll leave the cliffhanger for next week. So if you have time this week during your daily morning, evening, whenever you read your Bible, I'd encourage you guys to read a little more of Job, and maybe we can talk more about it next week. Thanks for your time.